Today we visited the market town of Penrith, which is just outside the Lake District. You can see the Lake District in the distance here. There are plenty of philosophy fans, not just sheep but horses as well. I must remind them to subscribe. The countryside is very nearby. These horses, for example, are actually in a field right in the town itself. Again, you can see the Lake District in the distance. So I shall walk down into the centre of the town, have a little exploration, and then I'll make my way to what's called Beacon Hill. This is a walk up to a local landmark called the Beacon. In times gone by, the Beacon was the site where fires were lit to warn of invaders from Scotland. Thankfully, there are few invaders these days. Here is the start of the walk. Hard to believe that we're actually in a town.
I think it's important to frame this discussion. My focus is on death anxiety. I am not discussing what philosophers refer to as ontology, that is, whether something exists or not. So, is there an afterlife? Is there a God? These type of considerations. What I'm concerned with is whether belief in these things helps to reduce anxiety. Death anxiety has several components. I'm concerned with non-existence, people's fear that they will cease to exist. I'm not talking about fear of, for example, the process of dying. Nobody wants to die painfully, nobody wants to suffer. That's granted. I'm just talking about this sense of you will cease to exist.
My main approach in this discussion is to adopt insights from philosophy.
These days we think of philosophy as a difficult subject, as an academic, highly abstract subject. But if we go back to the ancient Greeks, they thought of philosophy as very much a practical discipline, how to live. When I talk about Stoic philosophy, for example, many lessons from Stoic philosophy help to inform modern psychotherapeutic approaches, such as cognitive behavioural therapy. So the ancient Greeks knew what they were up to.
Step 1. Understand your fear. Some people seek solace in religion.
Intuitively, you'd think that belief in particularly a personal God would reduce death anxiety. You have that hope, which is often considered to be a religious virtue, that after you die, you live forever, you go to heaven. Now, interestingly enough, there are a lot of studies that show that intuition may not be quite right or needs to be qualified. People who are very religious, let's say they believe that they have had some sort of divine revelation.
And so they have a strong confidence that there is a God, that there is an afterlife, and this brings them relief. On the other hand, people who are moderately religious, people who, for example, were born into a religion,
it's not that they feel that they've had a profound transformative experience to generate their beliefs. It's just the country, the culture they're born into. Many of these people still have death anxiety. And in some sense, for some people, the death anxiety may be exacerbated. They may not be convinced that they will go to heaven. Perhaps they fear they'll go to hell, or a loved one will go to hell. So they have that anxiety. Or perhaps people who've come into a religion, they've come into a religion because they already have death anxiety and they're seeking some sort of solace. So studies show that people who are very religious and people who are atheist tend to have lower death anxiety than those people who are moderately religious. Non-theistic religions are quite interesting. So here, there's not a belief in a creator God, a personal God. There's a belief in some sort of spiritual force or perhaps consciousness. And so when a person dies, although the sense of self is lost, at least some aspects of the consciousness persist. So there is persistence, but perhaps not what, particularly to us people in the Western world, would normally think of. We'd normally want the individual self to persist.
I would like to suggest that it is this concern with the self which is often at the root of death anxiety.
Are you sure that you want to live forever anyway? I raise an interesting question. Let's say eternity beckons, so after you physically die, you persist as you are. So far, so good. So for the next 500 years, I'm going to play chess. For 1,000 years after that, I'm going to practice crosswords. So what are you going to do for the next 1,000, 1 billion, 10 trillion years? Seems to me that an ordinary human psychology would not be able to cope with immortality. So we would change. And we would change so much that we'd be no longer recognizable as we are now. So people who are hoping for more of what we have now, this sense of self, I suspect we'll be in for a little bit of a disappointment.
Step 2. Take a half-full glass approach.
So remember previously I've said there's some things in our control and some things outside of our control. One thing outside of our control is that there is always change. Everything has its time and then it changes. Now, we needn't be pessimistic about this. The fact that things change, the fact that life, for example, is finite, helps to motivate us to make the most of what we have now. If you did live forever, would you get anything done? Let's say you do want to paint a rival to the Mona Lisa and you're going to allocate 500 years to doing it. You will start tomorrow. Tomorrow comes, well, I've got eternity. I can put it off to next week. Next week comes, oh, I'm not in the mood. Next month, and so on. So it seems to me that if you were immortal, you would be the grand procrastinator.
Step 3. Maintain your health.
Of course, you can't avoid being reminded of your mortality, at least occasionally. But if you are in physical distress, if you have physical pain or related problems, then that's going to remind you of mortality much more often, and that's not going to be conducive to reducing your death anxiety. So, as always, be kind to yourself, keep yourself fit, life will be more pleasant.
Step 4. Create a legacy.
One of the things that gives rise to death anxiety is the sense that our projects will not be finished. So again, the finiteness of our lives helps to motivate us.
So in a sense, you can live on in your legacies. Create that wonderful YouTube video. Write that amazing book. Seneca said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. Life is long enough, and a sufficiently generous amount has been given to us for the highest achievements if we're all well invested." And of course, one source of anxiety is the fear of leaving negative legacies, such as never seeking forgiveness from somebody. Step 5. Do an Einstein.
Now, one idea I quite like in philosophy of time, is eternalism.
All times exist and always exist. There is no past, present, or future. What we think of as the present is simply the time we are currently experiencing. This current experience appears to move into what we can call the past as we journey in the block universe, but actually it always exists. That moment of time is permanently frozen. Our lives are like cinematographic movie frames.
So I want you to imagine the block universe, as the physicists say. All times exist. Past, present and future. They're all there in the block universe. There's no temporal becoming or ending. All times exist. And all times are on a par. So what we consider to be now, at this particular moment, somebody who we think is in the past is earlier than us in the block universe. They are thinking that they are in the now. And similarly, somebody later in the block universe, in our future, is thinking that their now is the now. It's a bit like places. So I am here, you are there. At least from my perspective. From your perspective, your place is here and I am there. So in other words, where we are in space, in place, is relative. Likewise for time. Now, why does this matter? Well, in the block universe, if all times exist, all times on a par, this means that you always exist in the block universe. This is now for me. Let's say 10 years later in the block universe from now, I also exist. Let's say 100 years from now, possibly I don't exist. But this part, this slice of the block universe that I am interpreting as now, always exists. So I always exist here. I always exist now. Now you might think this is so bizarre. This is a silly philosophical thought experiment. Another thought experiment by Martin. But actually this is often referred to as the scientific image of the universe. And there are arguments grounded in empirical data that this is how the universe actually is. Einstein came to believe this. In fact, if I remember correctly, he tried to comfort the widow of one of his friends by saying that for physicists, past, present and future don't exist as such. They're always there. So her recently departed husband still exists somewhere, sometime in the block universe. Now I'm not sure whether you find this comforting. Does this actually reduce death anxiety? But it's an interesting thought that we never truly go out of existence, that we are there somewhere, sometime in the block universe.
Step 6. Practice meditation.
Meditation is also a key resource to help with death anxiety. So this is based on that technique of you imagining you are the blue sky and the clouds floating by are your thoughts, and you're having a little bit of distance between you and the thoughts. You are not identifying with the thoughts. So in your meditative practice, I want you to try to imagine that you're no longer the blue sky, and you're perfectly contented with that. I'm not saying that the blue sky disappears and so you disappear. I'm simply saying that, for the sake of argument, whatever you are is not the blue sky anymore. The blue sky is a powerful sense of self. Have a little bit of distance between you and the sense of self. Like we were talking about the sense of difference between you and the clouds.
Finally, I have reached the summit of Beacon Hill, and here is the beacon. From the beacon, you have magnificent views of Penrith town and of the Lake District in the distance. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video. Bye for now.